I'd like to hand to Geoff Gerrand from Telstra.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy. And can I just say what a fantastic job Sandy has been doing. The whole thing has been running really, really smoothly. I actually would like to just start with a quick round of applause. Well done. All right, my name is Geoff Gerrand. I work in Telstra's regulatory department, but don't hold that against me. I'm actually really quite an okay kind of a guy. And I also sit on as the secretary of the Cybersecurity and Network Resilience work stream in the IoT Alliance of Australia, the IOTA. So I have a certainly more than a passing interest in security. So today's panel session, we're going to explore a few things, but it's mostly going to centre around the Department of Home Affairs recent consultation that closes this Friday on the Cybersecurity 2020 Strategy, Exhibit A. And if I was going to set a bit of a goal for the next hour, one of the things I would like us to see if we can do is see if there's enough of a quorum and enough content for a submission to that consultation from NetThing. So we're going to take a few notes and hopefully at the end of that, if we've got enough content and enough will and enough everything else, we might work feverishly on drafting a submission before the end of the week. So anyway, without any further ado, so that's kind of where we're aiming for in this session. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to ask each of the panellists just to firstly introduce themselves and give us like a few minutes, just a few minutes by way of introduction to help further set that scene. So Vanessa, I might throw to you in the first instance. Thank you.
I'm Vanessa Teague. I'm a cryptographer at the University of Melbourne, and I'd like to encourage people in response to the cybersecurity strategy to think about trying to answer the questions that are not being asked. Okay, with that in mind, and I was listening with great care to what Pia Andrews said earlier in the day about trying to understand how people work. I'm a cryptographer, I don't really understand how people work, but fortunately, people who understand better write books about it. And I'm going to start by reading from this absolutely superb book by Judith Brett called From Secret Ballot to Democracy Sausage, How Australia Got Compulsory Voting. Who's read it? If you haven't read it, you should. It's awesome. It's not just about compulsory voting, it's really about the whole history of Australian democracy. And she starts off asking how we were founded and distinguishing us from the American states that were set up in kind of conscious opposition to what they perceived as British tyranny. And she says, Australia, by contrast, was set up in a much more gentle way by a much more friendly relationship with the British government. She says, Australia didn't even have to pay for its own defence, as this was provided by the British government. With little taxation, why would people want to limit government expenditure on services that benefited them? So the function of government changed in Australia. It was not primarily to keep order within and defeat enemies without. It was a resource which settlers could draw on to make money. The paternalism of the Australian state is based on the circumstances of our settlement. Okay, so think about that and think about the unspoken assumptions that Australians bring to the general expectation that their government is benevolent and gentle and kind. And then read Australia's 2020 cybersecurity strategy. Okay, now, in particular, it seems to me to be infused with the unshakable belief that more active government involvement must be a good thing for cybersecurity. And if you look, for example, on page 9, it's all asking you questions about government's role in a changing world. Blah, 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 blah. I won't read it all, but in question, key to this, and again, I'm quoting from this document, is whether you think government could do more to confront cybercrime and protect the networks that underpin our way of life, or whether you think the current arrangements are right. Now, whether you agree with my perspective on this issue or not, just as a matter of pure logic, we're being given two options here. Number one, government should take a more active role in our cybersecurity and our networks and our computers, or the current balance is about right. Now, can anybody think of a third option that might be worth considering at this point? So in particular, in my humble opinion, what we've seen is over many years of Australian cybersecurity policy is bipartisan support for a series of very bad policies. The Defence Trade Controls Act made it a crime to export new cryptographic ideas or cryptographic software without permission from the military. We all know about the Toller Act, otherwise known as the AA Bill, that makes it compulsory to assist in undermining the security of your own system if you are able to re-engineer your system to extract more data. I think we're not just looking at a government that is, well-intentioned but a little bit ineffectual. We're actually looking at a series of policies that have actively done damage. And so I think in summary here, take a look at this policy. I don't think they're deliberately doing damage. I think they're pursuing an agenda oriented around surveillance and control, which inevitably has a byproduct of damaging our cybersecurity. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Vanessa. Lucie, I might throw to you next. Thank you.
Brilliant. I was promised that Vanessa would more hammer at the Assistance and Access Act explicitly, but I guess it was more of an implicit conclusion that you all had to make.
It's just an example, right? It's not the one and only thing.
That's true.
It's an example.
So I was concerned when we were both put together on this panel that it would be a little redundant because most of the time we just agree. I think for some background, because I think I'm a fresh face to a lot of people here, I moved here from Brussels, where I worked for Access Now, who's my current employer still, and I worked for 4 years on sort of EU and European legislation on cybersecurity, encryption, law enforcement access to e-evidence, as they like to call it, and surveillance data retention reform. So even though I'm a super new face, as Sandra likes to call it, here in Australia, I'm not super new to the discussions. And one of the things that I wanted to bring here with me is a little bit of the international sort of concerns and how I think what we've seen are the narratives that have emerged around cybersecurity. So internationally, I've been to IGF as a whole, and I think we also participate quite actively in the UN processes for those who follow the acronym-laden world that is the UN processes. The 2 things that I think emerge, and it's seen not just by civil society, I think some of the diplomatic delegations have perceived it as well, is that there's 2 sort of narratives on cybersecurity. And it's either states align with one or the other. And one is a narrative around national security. It's a narrative around control. It's what I think we would amicably call our Chinas and Russias, but I think there's a lot of other governments that would fall under those categories. And then there's this other narrative, I think, which is more favorable to the sort of people who attend IGF and who view the internet as a kind of shared common good and as an enabler of civic rights. And that's, seeing cybersecurity as being about integrity of networks, as being about security, and as being around the protection of individual users. I think working in Australia for a couple of months and being one of the few people apparently who gets paid to do it on a full-time basis. Woo, go me. I think Australia teeters on the edge of those. And I think when I read something like the cybersecurity strategy, that's really illustrated. And I think actually I would go as far as to say certain parts of the government aren't quite as aware as how much Australia sits with the Chinas and Russias in the sort of narrative that's building here around national security. And so one of the things, when I wrote our submission to the consultation, which again, I can afford to write a very lengthy one because I get paid 9 to 5 to sit at my computer and type these words into documents. And I commend a lot of you who do it on your own time because that's really the community lives and thrives and is able to continue like that. What I recommended is that the government actually not just focus on the questions that are posed, which are, wow, incredibly leading, but actually look at an audit of existing systems and government programs. Because what's happened, in spite of the cybersecurity objectives, which were there since 2016, since 2017, the whole narrative and the way that the government views this space has been about control. And I think a lot of us, when we talk about the internet as open, free, and secure, we forget that the internet has trickled down to us from a history of being used as a military technology. It's the way, and it's why we still struggle with things like export controls and cryptography. The way that these things are controlled is defined by states viewing it as a means of sort of control and dictating the way the world runs, right? So much like Vanessa, we are also frustrated that encryption is still on export controls list, but the reason that is because governments don't love the proliferation of security. It doesn't serve the national security interest to have what they view as adversaries or competing interests, at the higher most level of security. And I think that's an issue that often when we have, conversations in rooms like this or in other IGFs, people are like, but I want my open and free internet. It's like there's a huge geopolitical machine that kind of exists in an echo chamber for the government where, these narratives take place. And so I think that's a part of the issue. It's not necessarily, it's not insurmountable, but in my experience, the sort of echo chamber that manifests around the government, which currently you guys see very explicitly here, is just those people get a lot more airtime with decision makers. And even when I sat in Brussels, I was often one cybersecurity and geo person, and the rest was very heavily populated by industry. It was very heavily populated by people from home affairs ministries, because they have huge resources and they have the abilities to be there. So I think what we need to have a conversation about, I guess, is how to get more people funding to do this, but how to make sure that we get more airtime and work together. Because the narrative otherwise that is going to be predominant and that is going to be perpetuated by people like Mike Peluso and Peter Dutton and others is that there is a national security threat, and the way to counter it is innately through each one of these policies. And I think I'll leave it at there because I'm rambly and I tend to go over time. But it's not totally all lost. There is ways to engage, and I hope that we get to dig into that a little bit in the communication Q&A. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucie. Matt.
Hi everyone, my name's Matt Tett. I'm the Managing Director of NX Test Lab. We break things and write reports, or we measure things and write reports. I'm also the Chair of the IoT Alliance, Workstream Enabler 3, Cybersecurity and Network Resilience. And I guess I'm here today more talking around how potential, or there is a need for building a trusted market of secure technology. So we come from the perspective of looking at the vendors and the vendors' products which are out there, and then talking about how do we know who to trust. We're told not to trust some, we're told to trust others, but how do we know what we're really looking for? So, and I think in the context of obviously a governance forum, we do have to talk about government and their role in that. And obviously, Holly said this morning, we need a public service that reverts to listening. I wonder how much listening they should be allowed to do, and what sort of communications they should listen into or not. But as people who know me, I'm not a policy guy, I'm not a legislative guy, so I look more for facts and reality in the technologies rather than the ways of writing words around those. So thank you, fellow panellists. I wish I could refer to a book. However, the only book that I've been referred to in was around pornography and censorship on the internet, and we won't go there, by Geoff Sparrow, a friend of Richard's and Stilgarian. So Stil's looking at me confused. That's okay. So I will not quote from that book. As I said, unfortunately, vendors don't necessarily design their products and services with security or even privacy, and even barely safety in mind these days. As I said, we're part of the IoT Alliance. Explosion of the internet, connected smart technologies is really happening now, and unfortunately vendors really need to step up and build in security, privacy and safety by design. They can't just keep releasing products which are insecure and expecting us to know when and how to patch them, or if we can even patch them. So we can't keep bolting it on. Nations are obviously always struggling to regulate, and I think a lot of the work that we do is unregulatable, if that's a word. And we're now seeing nations forcing providers into building splinter nets. So I don't think we're in the day of the internet as a whole. I think we're in the day of the internet. Privacy is obviously one of the biggest ones, with the multinational companies clamouring for us to give them our private information so they can sell it. As we know, you don't get something for nothing. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of consumers have given away a great deal of their privacy already. GDPR is a critical one, obviously, in Europe, and it has come up on a number of events that we've been in attendance at recently, that maybe it's a solution to our problems. But as I said, I think regulation and big fines aren't necessarily going to make vendors any more responsible for the technologies that they're selling to those clients that are losing our personal information. One would hope, and this is hope because we do work with a lot of agencies and departments in procurement, that they actually start asking for secure technologies, not just price and features and functionality. As I said, you never get something for nothing, so we've got to look for it. It is a tough job being in government. We do work with a lot of government departments and agencies, and some of the more questionable ones in this room as well, unfortunately. And they do have a hard job, so I also sympathise with where they're coming from. But I think, as Pia said, a user-centred policy is probably a good one, and working towards the issues together. And I like the consultation paper, but I'm not sure how much of a consultation it actually is. So it contradicts some existing policies within government. So probably the one from a technical perspective is obviously the Access Bill, or TOLA, and company organisations like Cyber, a government-funded organisation to get cybersecurity startups in Australia going, and the vendors, having some local cybersecurity vendors developing products. Any other nation that knows we have this bill is not going to be taking our cybersecurity products seriously. So I think that's one of the big things is, on one hand, they're giving, on the other hand, they're taking away. And I think that's a really difficult situation for us as an industry. How can we trust that those vendors haven't been asked to put access into their systems without even their knowledge? So I think that's a very difficult one. My personal opinion is we do need to plan 10 years ahead. We can't just sit there looking at the short term or even the medium term. We need to look for the good in 10 years and the bad in the 10 years, and we need to move towards the good. Obviously, there's always going to be good and bad, but if we can't plan that far out, it's really hard. So yeah, forward thinking, Holly mentioned that. And I think it's all good to be critical to a point, and also point out the problems, but I like to see actions and outcomes rather than just problems being disseminated. So whenever we are asked to evaluate a critical technology, we actually go to the critics and listen to them and listen to what they're actually saying about it. And that's generally the easiest way. They generally know what they're talking about, and that's what we'll write our methodologies around. So critics are good, but we also want to hear solutions to problems. So thank you, Geoff.
Cool, thank you, Matt. All right, I'm going to exercise a small amount of moderator privilege and ask the first round of questions. So, Vanessa, one to you. You've mentioned the TOLA Act, the Access and Assistance Act. To what extent do you think that legislation like that is undermining Australia's security and perhaps our place in the world as a technology exporter?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I agree very much with what Lucie and Matt just said, and I think it's important to realise that the so-called national security is, if it's oriented around surveillance and control, it's actually a national insecurity agenda. You know, if it's undermining our technology industry, if it's causing companies to move offshore that would otherwise have been building secure products here and training people in cybersecurity here, then it's actually, it's not just neutral, it's actually making it harder for us to do a good job of defending ourselves. Right? So are we ever going to see specific evidence that a particular successful cyber attack against us was a direct consequence of that law? No, we're probably not, right? We're probably just going to see a gradual failure for us to grow in the cybersecurity space, and we're going to be more vulnerable over the long term. We're probably not going to be able to point to direct evidence that some particular data breach or some particular failure of security was a direct result of some company that moved away or some person who didn't have the skills to defend it. But that doesn't mean that the consequences aren't real, just because they're not explicit and easily pointed to. I guess something that occurs to me as I'm sitting here in this room full of intelligent people thinking about this policy is to ask maybe the opposite question, right? At the risk of undermining the whole purpose of what you set the panel up for, right? Maybe instead of thinking about yet another nice letter that we could all write to the people in Home Affairs who so carefully read all our submissions that we have written 10,000 times before, maybe instead we could think about what we could actually build that would do a better job of securing our communications with the knowledge that the policy that is being directed from Canberra is wrong.
Fantastic. No, thank you, Vanessa. And absolutely, the more sort of angles that we run at this from, and the more controversy, I guess, we inject into it, the more robust and ultimately fruitful the conversation will be. Matt, I might ask you a question since you're still holding it. I know, I could see you were trying to hand the microphone away. So we've got the government, they've got a consultation out around this policy, and to date the sorts of things, at least I've heard, thank you, the sorts of things I've heard is, to some extent, backing away would be a better position rather than trying to, bring in more control and Vanessa, as you've said, if the policy is around surveillance and so on, then it's not security, it's insecurity sort of thing. But Matt, are there some things that if we stand back and kind of had a bit of a wish list and said, here are some things that the government actually really could usefully do that would... So ignore the questions, because I don't think the questions get us there, but if there were some things, not your questions, the ones in the consultation, those questions, ignore those questions.
I did bring a lighter. Could be...
No, I'm asking...
I want to create the ashes.
Yeah, I know.
I know ashes.
I know where you're headed. You just want to set fire to the thing. But not what could you usefully do? What could government usefully do to help improve cybersecurity?
Well, thank you, Geoff. As I've sat in many of these government meetings, and I can never watch those shows like Yes Minister and things like that, because unfortunately you have to squirm. I did once get asked the question, how mandatory is mandatory? You do need to ask yourself that question, Matt, before you start this work. I said, did you just say that? Yes. Do you know that there's a probity officer sitting at the end of the table? Yes. Can you answer my question? I'm like, it's mandatory. That's not the answer that I wanted. I said, okay, that's fine. Well, you're not going to get the answers you want from us either. Sorry. So I think from our perspective, and obviously you as a secretary of the workstream and me as the chair, we have been working towards this since 2017. We did release our strategic plan for strengthening IoT security in Australia. I think Australia is too small. I think it's the globe, but at the end of the day, we got to start somewhere. We have a number of initiatives that we've built within our workstream, and it should be noted that we've got 150 odd members in the workstream, and we're all volunteers, so none of us are actually paid. This is our side jobs, if that's it. Yeah. And at the end of the day, there's a number of key initiatives that we've been working towards, which in the government meetings I would refer to as quick wins. Oh, that's a quick win for us. So one of them is the IoT reference framework, which came out of our architecture subgroup. We suddenly decided there were 450 odd different potential IoT platforms. And so we got our architecture group working on not developing 450 security reference architectures. That would have taken them quite some time, but to develop a generic architecture which actually looks like a network stack. It actually has 10 layers, and it can be populated from anyone regardless of where their position is within the IoT stack, and they can actually draw a picture, I'm not going to use the word perimeter, around their IoT network, but their ecosystem, they can actually get a good picture of that, and then we can overlay our risk, compliance and regulatory requirements around that, and as they ever change, we can continue to update that. So in organisations like smart cities, they have the ability to actually ring fence their ecosystem regardless of how many devices, vendors, products, networks, technologies are actually in there. That then led on to the work that we're doing with the IoT Security Certification Trust Mark, so basically certifying the vendors' claims around the security of their products. So everyone says their product's the number one product in the world and it's never going to be compromised, and there's no vulnerabilities in it on the day that it's released. However, as we all know, vendors' marketing is generally far better than the vendors' products itself. So you do need some level of independent assurance that their claims around their security are actually being met, and security is only as good as the day there isn't a vulnerability which has been known or released. So there are mechanisms within that certification program to ensure that vendors remain compliant on that list. And then the last thing we're working on is demand side and supply side awareness guides. So putting in plain simple English for consumers of IoT, whether they're mums and dads buying a smart TV or a smart speaker, or whether they're critical national infrastructure procurement departments and agencies, empowering them with the questions that they need to ask from their retailers and their suppliers and their manufacturers. And then conversely, and this may not necessarily relate to the larger vendors or manufacturers, but actually some of the smaller ones, particularly startups and developers, how to start looking at building products that are secure by design, safe by design, and adhere to good privacy principles. So there's a sort of a three-pronged approach, and obviously maintaining relationships with international organisations and governments is also key. So a little bit of a pitch, but at the end of the day, I think it's good here.
Yes. No. So good pitch. Thank you.
Securing products, right? Giving a trusted market, and you've got to do it.
So what would the government usefully do? And it wouldn't necessarily have to be the scheme that the IOTA has come up with. But what would government actually usefully do around that?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, obviously within government, if you're looking at defence critical equipment, then you've got common criteria. So certification standards are a key, or at least a set of guidelines that vendors need to adhere to get their products to an acceptable level. You can't expect every vendor to put every product through common criteria, so you need one step down from that. The issue with government is policy and agendas change as quickly as government changes. So to have a continual, like I said before, you need something that's going to go 10, 15, 20 years into the future, not potentially a 3-year term or a 2-year term or whatever. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that government has to struggle with. The guys in the department stay the same, but unfortunately their policies change, and then they change direction, and we've seen that time and time again, particularly in security. And you can't just be secure for a certain period of time. It's got to be an ongoing initiative that you've got to push through.
Okay, good. So getting behind industry developed, because that gives you the longevity to sustain multiple government terms, getting behind industry initiatives for testing for security against, you said, a kind of a minimum set of standards which would be internationally recognised. Yep. Perfect.
Yeah, so NISA have a really good set of IoT cybersecurity, guidelines for vendors, and that was released in the end of 2017. So that's a really good baseline or benchmark to start from.
Perfect, thank you. Lucie, just so that you don't get away off the hook lightly, you've obviously got a lot of very broad international experience that you bring to the table. Looking through that lens, what international, perhaps either policy objectives or goals or things, could we usefully bring into Australia, into the Australian context, to help us inform a response to the Cyber 2020 strategy?
Whew. Yeah, there's a lot. I think, interestingly, actually, 2-3 weeks ago, the current government stated that we should be wary of the amount of international influence that we let trickle down into Australian policy. And whenever I read headlines like that, I think, like, what happened? at the international level that the government is so unhappy with that they have to like start sort of this PR campaign nationally of like, hey, I know we signed up to the international agreements, but like we don't like it at the moment. I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is the government, if any government that is really serious about cybersecurity needs to divorce it from the national security narrative. You can't have the people whose sole interest is in the insecurity of like its own population be in the room forming cybersecurity policy. When you have law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, with a clear interest of having their jobs made easier in that room, and you don't have the technologists, and you're not listening to the people who are responsible for that infrastructure, for protecting that infrastructure, and people who rely on that infrastructure. So often it's a room full of white guys in suits, and I'm sorry, that conversation, as we had the conversation with inclusion and disability, if you're excluding women, if you're excluding minorities, if you're excluding indigenous communities, wherever you are from the conversation, then yeah, obviously you're setting up, a cyber secure environment for who? Like the white guys? Okay, cool. Like we don't exist in that space. And I think that's, for anyone who's not been on the receiving end of government surveillance, is an issue. And I think it's a cultural issue. So I'm Czech by origin, and in my country we had socialism, and under socialism everyone was under surveillance. They deliberately built buildings with like very thin walls so that neighbors could spy on each other, and they were incentivized to do that. And I think that there's a lot of parallels that I draw in the thinking of how we design infrastructure nowadays. It's still on that same basis. But in the Czech Republic, this has created like a real hatred for the surveillance state. And so people, the discussion that we have in Europe is very different from the discussion I would have here, because I think culturally people just haven't seen what really like ubiquitous surveillance and people being pegged against each other looks like. And that's fine. Maybe that's a reality and dystopia that we need to live through in order to fix it. But yeah, I would say decoupling that, because when you look at things, and I work in, for instance, one of my big passions has been vulnerability disclosure. And one of the things that governments are now coming out with are vulnerability equities processes. Big things. Probably a couple of people in the room know what that means. But basically intelligence agencies now in their kind of quest to secure us hold on to certain software or hardware vulnerabilities that they know, because they can exploit it then maybe to conduct surveillance or investigations for the sake of international security. And that debate started because a couple of those vulnerabilities were then used in, for instance, WannaCry and other places, and a huge amount of people globally were compromised. And the question was, what was the role of the government in that instance in protecting the infrastructure and protecting the cybersecurity of people versus, keeping that for a very minute, sort of small national security purpose. And that the issue, and the reason I say that those things need to be decoupled, is because when you speak about national security, when you speak about things like terrorism, child exploitation, and any other, the issues that fall underneath it, it's a zero-sum game. Like, there's no amount of risk that we're willing to compromise. So that equation, when you do that weighing equation of should we keep that, vulnerability for us, is so skewed. It's so hard to build a case of like, you should disclose that to the public, because the interests that sit at that table are so heavily invested in making sure that there's an absolute zero risk. So that's why I say, if you want to talk about cybersecurity and you want to build resilient networks and you want to make sure your infrastructure is secure, you need to have that conversation with the technologists. You need to have that conversation with the engineers. You need to have that conversation with the people who are innately targeted through those networks. Minorities, be it women, and those people are so often not the people in the room.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucie.
Dramatic.
Yeah, no. Very, very good. Very, very good food for thought. Time for you to get a little bit more involved. Any questions, comments from the floor? We have a few. What I'm going to do is, I think, same as last time, we'll invite people to come down just to one of the mics, introduce yourself. So, yeah, you had your hand up first if you wanted to just wander down. Oh, sorry.
We can
Oh,
run the mics.
okay, can we run the mics?
Yeah, run the mics.
Are you happy to... Richard, you're on the way out now anyway.
Sorry, just for recording.
Okay, well, while Holly's getting there, a couple of framework statements. First of all, Matt, since you're quoting me, I might add to what you're saying. Two frameworks that I'd like to pose. The first I'd like to say is Bruce Schneier, and if you read his books, he says, look, we actually have to redefine security and what it means. We need to rethink in terms of, and this is picking up Vanessa's point. So I think that's probably the framework. The other is Macron, who was speaking in the 2018 IGF in France. When he opened it, he said, what we need is a balance between the kind of John Perry Barlow cybersecurity independence and the Great Firewall of China. We actually need something that balances people's individual rights, privacy, security. So redefine security in terms of the balance that's struck. And we need everybody around the table to do that. That would be my framework. Thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you, Holly. I'll probably take that as a comment unless anybody from the panel, Lucie.
Can I just a quick response to that? So I'm totally biased because Bruce Schneier is on our board. But I hate the narrative of balance when we speak about cybersecurity because at least sitting in like a lot of rooms with Europol and the kind of departments of Home Affairs in Europe, I think it's so often like we need to strike the balance between security and privacy. And I think that's a narrative that civil society needs to dispel more actively because, and I think the kind of where we come in is like, there is like, this is reinforcing security and privacy. Like that is how you ensure, like giving people privacy is how you ensure security. And those things can't be pitted in a balance. And I think this was, this is so, there's such a, and I think that goes back to sort of the cultural almost misunderstanding and the way that, you know, and the way you set up the people who are in the room. I remember, and I'll end there because I'm conscious of time and I want to give everyone the opportunity to speak. But I was speaking at the OSCE forum at one point, and OSCE is like a broader organization. You have a couple of states like Azerbaijan in the room, and the guy from Azerbaijan was like, well, like the points you made are really, really nice. It's very cute. Thank you. But what you're missing is that as a state, our first and foremost responsibility is to make sure people don't die. And so everything is like, as a state for us, everything else has to be secondary. And I was like, whoa, dude, that's really not how human rights work. But like, obviously you didn't get that briefing. So like, let's talk at the break because this is embarrassing. But really there's a lot of states in that room at the Council of Europe and at OSCE and other places that really view, you know, that led the national security narrative completely overrule everything else. And that's it's like a terms of reference issue that you almost get when you speak internationally to people. It's the issue I have here. People, like, we reference GDPR, but there's a huge disconnect between what data protection means in Europe, what privacy means in Europe, and what that means here. Because we have a fundamental right to data protection, and we have a separate fundamental right to privacy. And so that's defined, those terms of reference have defined that framework completely differently. And it's one of the reasons why copy and paste legislations don't work across the world. Those things look very differently to different people. Sorry.
Perfect, thanks. Richard, I'll throw to you next, and then there was a question.
What I was going to ask just got covered comprehensively. Thank you.
Perfect. Did you have a question? Yep. Yeah. If you want, please. And then we'll go to you
next. Hi, my name is Dennis. I'm one of the students at UTS actually, and my capstone is actually on securing medical devices, IoT medical devices. So I would love to talk to you afterwards as well, because I'm looking at the policy side. So one of the question I had was, so it is about developing standard as well, like as you mentioned before. But what about the things that's currently like embedded into our systems now? Should we audit them? Because like Japan's already doing that 200 million devices, looking those over. So what about? So what do you take? What's your view and take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think legacy devices are one of the biggest risks. I mean, I think you're lucky that you're researching in the medical industry, because we've got the Therapeutic Goods Administration, who technically are supposed to look after the security and safety of medical devices, whereas a lot of other industries aren't as highly regulated. So, but that's not to say that those products don't have vulnerabilities. And as you said, legacy devices are really, really critical. I think probably one of the best examples of legacy in organisations of significant national interest is SCADA. So SCADA systems, when they were never designed to be internet connected, but they still had comms. The minute those started being internet connected, they were compromised, and the vendors and the owners of those utilities found out very quickly what could go wrong. And so, yeah, absolutely, things need to be audited. Things like Mirai, where some of the cameras are unpatchable. So at the end of the day, that's going to be out there forever. And that's only going to hobble our technology if we don't get it right. Probably one of the biggest cases I use is in consumer electronics, is how long do people expect their internet connected speakers and TVs and toasters and fridges and dishwashers and ovens and everything to stay online? 10 years, 15 years? How's a vendor going to support that for 10 or 15 years, a reasonable lifespan of that product? Are they going to brick it? Are they going to disconnect it from the internet after its end of life? Are people going to accept that? Are people going to pay maintenance agreements because they spent $800 on a 50-inch TV? $800 isn't going to go very far if you're looking for maintenance for the next 10 years, while you expect that TV to be hung on your wall and connected to the internet. So I think there's a lot of basic questions we've got to ask of vendors around that, in terms of what is going to happen to that technology in the future. So yeah, really, really good point. We'll catch up with you later.
And just one more question, sorry. So when I looked at a lot of different IoT policies that got passed in Europe, California recently, and all of that, they really cover, one, they don't cover as much as you wanted to. Yep. Two, they cover a lot, try to look into network, how things get sent. Yep. But you can't really do much when the attackers have the device on their hand. Yep. So what do you think of that? How do you think the policy should be built on that side? Because, I just haven't really seen any that covers that side of it.
I think a lot of the regulatory policy, particularly the stuff which is coming out of the US at the moment, is more around policing and enforcement. So how do they monetize any breaches in security? And I think the California policy basically says you're not allowed to sell an internet-connected device unless it's compliant with these three principles. As if a consumer is going to look for those three principles to be met before they buy something, and as if an importer's going to do that as well. So I think at the end of the day, that's and how are they going to police it? It's almost an impossible act that they've basically set. And then to answer your question, at the end of the day, you've got to draw a map of the whole ecosystem. An IoT device isn't a standalone product. It's connected in some way, and it's doing a certain job. And a sensor could be operating in a vehicle, which is a human life depending on it, or it could be embedded in a wall looking at the humidity in a room. And so I think it's a use case as well that we really need to look at, which is why I said our reference framework's a really good thing, because it looks at the industry specific application and everything that thing's connected to. Even if it's a $5 sensor, it's still critical, and it could have an insecurity. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Angus Murray from Electronic Frontiers Australia. I think this is an excellent conversation, and if I could tie this back to how we positively frame what government could do, with my personal view that the Tooler Act, or the Tooler and the AA Bill, is probably one of the most destructive things that we could have done as an international economy and generally within our own country. One of the tensions that exist, and I think that the point was made by Lucie really well, is the need to divorce cybersecurity from national security and decouple these things. It seems to me that government drives itself on a perpetual notion of fear and the need to put these in to protect people. As a part of reframing the policy discussion, how does the panel think that we could turn this into a positive so there is human rights focus as the optimistic outcome rather than fear as the pessimistic driver?
Who would like to field that?
It doesn't necessarily have to be focused on the current government and trying to alter their politics in a positive way, right? It can be focused on something that we'd like to do that's positive. For example, securing our election systems or securing ordinary communications for kids or adults or whatever. I think we should focus on stuff that we could build rather than focusing on trying to change their minds, because it's not going to work.
I think one of the things that need to happen is more people need to have a conversation with the local representatives too. Like, I think there's a lot of just a lack of information and awareness of what the electorates are really concerned about. And a lot of the times people kind of participate, and I would always encourage, like, participate in consultations. It's good as a field of reference. But, you know, for instance, when I was in IGF at that time, you know, we had a panel on cybersecurity as well and international norms, and it was like, how many of you have gone, you know, to your local elected officials and said, I'm really concerned about this. I'm concerned about my individual security and about the security of our community and our ability to do, you know, community work, work with women who were victims of domestic violence, etc. You know, these are all of the things that I need you to take into account when you go to international. And a lot of, like, no one raised their hand. And there was, you know, we had a huge youth representation. We had people who are full-time, you know, society. And so I think that's missing. And I think we could do a lot better in making sure those conversations happen and making sure we try to influence that change. And that's not just on the federal level, but also, like, in the individual sort of territories. You can have that conversation with a lot of people. There's also now, I think, the digital cities, like the UN initiative, which I think Sydney signed, somewhat ironically, given its, like, omnipresence of surveillance. But, you know, so there are local sort of ways to claw back some privacy. And the amount of places we've now seen that are signing anti-facial recognition bills, you know, we won't use surveillance in our cities, that is a huge signage from the local communities that says the national conversations are failing us, you're failing to protect our rights, and we're going to take whatever mandate these regional fora have, city level, whatever it be, to claw back some of the dignity and integrity that we want in this community. So don't underestimate, like, the small steps we can start, because eventually they won't be able to ignore it.
Which is aligned, I think, with the comments in the first panel session around the medical health records and the signal that people are sending by saying, you know what, I value my privacy over longevity, I think was the way it was framed.
I think I was just going to say something really quickly. Sorry. Yeah, so just backing in onto that from a technical perspective, I think the issue that we've seen in the industry is that, yeah, the government doesn't differentiate between their undermining of cybersecurity and their support of cybersecurity. So it's not just the vendors. So even 2014, the CEO of Cisco wrote a letter to Barack Obama, said, I'm sick of asking you behind closed doors. This is now an open letter. Can your agents stop compromising our equipment in the supply chain, because it's really beginning to affect our business and the trust in our products in the marketplace? And that's a domestic manufacturer in a country that's supposed to be one of the more secure, if you like. So again, it's an example of trust, and you've got to engender that trust. And if you can't do it, then citizens aren't going to follow you.
All right, I think we've got time for about 3 more questions. I'm going to throw to you next, then to George.
Regarding the rollout of 5G and Huawei being barred from making a 5G network in Australia, I just read recently that the UK and Boris Johnson, they allowed Huawei to roll out their 5G network with some access, most access, and in Europe as well. Similarly, I've talked to a lawyer who's from the Netherlands, and he said that Huawei is just seen as another manufacturer of 5G equipment over there, and 65% of their contracts are actually in Europe. Whereas because the US and its allies are claiming that because Huawei pose a security threat, they are being barred from rolling out their technology. So what do you think about this? And do you think that Huawei does pose a threat, given that most technology is made in China anyway?
I'd like to see statement of claims. So whenever that comes across our desk, which it has, I always say, what's the claims? What are you basing it on at the end of the day? Is it more security? Do you not have the access that you need to that equipment? Are they not providing you with the information that you want? And it's always a black door. It's always a closed door. So it's really hard to comment. And yeah, countries like the UK have embraced Huawei in the past. We had a lab in the UK from 2007 to 11, and we used to evaluate their gear from a security perspective. And then they established their own within government to evaluate their own products. So they did have a lot of involvement over in the UK. So it's sort of good to see that rationale's probably holding out over some of this fear and uncertainty and doubt without claims. If we have claims, we can verify them.
I think in a way what's happening with Huawei is really fantastic because it illustrates how when states kind of manipulate this area to their own advantage, what happens to the global marketplace. And I think that's, you know, if you're, as a European, you're saying the only technology we will use will be European made. As an American, you're saying the only technology we'll be used is American made. You're going to break the economy real quick. So I think that hopefully it leads to a better conversation about, you know, be it supply chains and sort of how do we, you know, ensure that systematically we can provide answers to questions. I also think Huawei is like on a really fun like PR campaign through Europe right now, because they're trying to fix their standing. But I will say it's not just an issue of, you know, it's made in China and we can't trust it. There are a couple of technological studies that show that Huawei doesn't make the best 5G infrastructure. It's not the most secure that's on the market. So there's an angle to this where I'm like, maybe, you know, there's a consideration here that just because they have the cheapest and they have very overinflated reporting numbers of where currently the biggest suppliers, you know, that's maybe not just the key reasoning behind why they're being barred from the markets.
That's what I was going to say too.
Yeah, all vendors.
Yes. I agree. I was about to say exactly the same thing. Yeah, right. I think in the question, you know, is Huawei really a security threat or is everything else a security threat as well? The answer is yes and yes, right? I think this kind of narrative that Huawei is a security threat and everything else is perfectly trustworthy is completely false. I think we need to think about whether we can design our systems in a way that is not necessarily placing trust in the untrustworthy components of our infrastructure, right? For example, if I'm running an end-to-end encrypted communication on my phone, it shouldn't matter who makes the network infrastructure that I use to communicate. It matters who made my phone. And I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about who we're trusting and whether we can spread the trust around a bit.
All right. Yeah. Cool. I'm going to throw to George very quickly.
George Fong, I'm from the internet. In a galaxy far, far away a long time ago, there was the ultimate democracy and how you run stuff. It was the IAB and the IETF, and everybody agreed and produced RFCs. Vanessa, you've struck me with the comment that you've made with regard to let's build better systems. Don't we, and this is an open question, we already know how to encrypt. We already know that NAT, not MAT, NAT is evil. We know that V6 has IPsec built in. You know, is it a situation where we are saying, oh, look, government's being bad, but our practices are shocking, in terms of the types of security layers that we're putting into place. And I agree with you, in building a better system and saying, well, forget about that, have we already got the tools that we should be using better?
Very, very brief answer if somebody wants to.
Yeah, why don't people use them? Right? That's the question. Because you're right, the tools are there, why don't we use them?
Perfect. All right, I'll throw to Paul next.
Sure. The security issue, I think, with government is they haven't actually specified what they're saying they're securing. What they're actually securing is their votes, right? If we're totally clear, that's actually what they are securing, and their power to get those votes in the future. So it might be worth actually pushing government to say, actually, well, no, what are the different things that we are trying to secure, and what are the contradictions and trade-offs that are inherent in, for example, preventing crime from being able to occur, which is Peter Dutton's favourite pastime, and totally get the value in that. But we also have to do is to protect democracy from the aggregation of too much power that could actually prevent us from committing thought crimes under an oppressive government, right? That, in that simple term, there is this kind of contradiction. So that's one piece. Also, just in return to what we were talking about just before, the whole Huawei question is actually that in Australia, we trust the Five Eyes countries who are putting the back doors in the Cisco kit that we're using and the Ericsson kit and everything that we're using with our European friends more than we trust the Chinese government and their back doors. It's actually nothing more than or less than simple geopolitics. We wouldn't expect China to put Cisco kit in for the same reason, right? It is just simple geopolitics. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, and it's also changing though, but anyway. And otherwise, I would say that the key in terms of, can we actually have secure technology, it has to be transparent. If something is a black box, you cannot by definition trust it. And it's the same with the phones, right? The microphone connects to the cellular modem, connects to the lawful intercept module, connects to so on, so on, so on. Until we break these things apart and make the air gap so that we can actually pull them apart, we're destined to lose. Thanks.
Perfect, all right. I'll take your question as the last question.
No worries. I was wondering if there's anyone out here who's doing any kind of asymmetric approaches to dealing with this issue, because call me a pessimist. I'd like to call myself a pragmatist, but I don't see much long-term progress in trying to convince the government to take their hands off the cookie jar. What about a bunch of seasoned cryptography experts, for example, declaring themselves a shadow terrorist group who are going to who lay down a challenge to the Australian government and say, okay, use all the powers you've just granted yourself in the Toller Act to try and stop us from achieving a particular objective. This is the objective we're going to do. We're going to train a bunch of otherwise uneducated citizens of Australia to carry out
12-year-olds probably.
To carry out a simulated, terrorist attack or something that this bloody law is supposedly going to all protect us from, and train them up using very simple technologies and techniques. This to actually carry out an event, and that does something dramatic, ends up with something happening to Peter Dutton's phone or something like that. Something like that, which then grabs a headline which enables you to educate the general public about how pointless and worthless and counterproductive these things are. Just an idea.
It's a very good suggestion. Would anybody like to quickly respond?
I think there's
is that our action point from this meeting?
There's a really quick... There's a really cool... Yeah, sorry. I'm going to I think Vanessa should speak to this, because I think what you've done with the voting, sort of demonstrating how voting is incredibly broken is one of those instances. I think there's a really deep, dark rabbit hole you're asking people to go down. And I think we have to be careful about the onus we put on individuals in these cases. Being on the terrorist list is not a fun situation to be in. We work with a lot of people who adversely are placed on those lists in different countries. And it's also one of the reasons, when I speak publicly, I'm here on a work visa. It's a shaky situation. I also have to be careful about what I say. So I think the sort of onus that we put on people in those instances, we have to be careful what we're asking.
Good. All right. A fantastic note to end. Oh, Vanessa. Okay, very quickly. Go.
Oh, no, I agree
I've
with
been
Lucie.
given the wind up.
I love the idea of action. I try to maximise impact while minimising the chance I go to jail. So think about that over lunch.
I think Geoff, we can put that one down to climbing the Digital Harbour Bridge.
Cool. All right. I would like you to join with me in thanking the panel for a very interesting and enlightening conversation.